The Open Therapy Institute is addressing bias in mental health care. Go to our website, openTherapyInstitute.org. We have CE credit workshops about overlooked issues in the field. You can go to our workshop page and register now and become a member. And for those looking for a therapist, we match people with someone who's highly skilled and truly open. Just contact us through the contact page on the website or email us at info@openTherapyInstitute.org. Hello, I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm speaking with Andrew Hartz of the Open Therapy Institute for another episode of our Open Therapy podcast. Nice to see you today, Andrew.
Good to see you, Leslie.
So we're just on the heels of the culmination of an election cycle, and I think tensions are so high, no matter what side a person was on in the election. And some of that polarization and the rhetoric around the election is really intense. And so I wonder if it might be a good thing to talk about what's going on for people right now in the wake of that.
Yeah, this is such like it's interesting because it's Wednesday morning when we're recording this. It's the day after the election. So it was just announced that Trump won. And, I'm in New York and it's not 2016 here,
Mm-hmm.
just to be clear, but there are clearly people that are upset.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are some people who are happy even here. It's hard to tell. It doesn't feel like the apocalypse the way that, it did in Manhattan in 2016, where I think people really felt that. But people are clearly really upset. And then there's also a lot of people who are really happy. I think this is a really challenging issue to talk about. And it does impact a lot of people. So I'm excited to just talk about it.
Yeah, I am too. And I feel like, so when you and I were talking just before we hit record, you mentioned that you don't disclose to people who you voted for. And
Mhm.
I, that reminds me of when I was younger, and that was the way people did that. My parents didn't talk about it. They talked about the pros and cons, but they stayed out of giving their endorsement to one side or the other. There was kind of this joke with my parents that they canceled each other's votes out
Mm.
because they fell on different sides of issues often, but they didn't talk about politics the way that we've gotten used to hearing people talk about politics. There's such an overt attempt to influence other people to feel the way that we do so often right now. And I think that's different to the way that my perception is anyway that people used to handle political decision making.
Yeah, I mean, I try my rule for the record of and it's partly like maybe my responsibility that I feel the Open Therapy Institute and what my role is there, but I kind of made a rule. I don't know how good I am at keeping to this, but it's like I'm not going to talk about anything that isn't about psychology or mental health. So,
Mm-hmm.
like I have opinions about all kinds of things, like foreign policy,
Right.
trade policy, immigration policy. I've got opinions. But if there's not a psychological component to it, who am I? I'm just a guy. So I kind of felt like there's no need to weigh in
Mm-hmm.
on anything that isn't directly related to what we do. And I don't really want to be somebody who's like speaking on behalf of OTI, but I do worry that I'm perceived that way. So if I endorse candidate A or B, that then becomes the OTI's candidate, and we
Mm-hmm.
have a diverse, views at OTI. There are people who voted for Trump, there are people who didn't, and people who voted for Kamala, and so we just in kind of we share the vision of addressing bias in mental health care and expanding dialogue around these issues, but people have different views. So I just try to not rock the boat by weighing in on anything I don't feel like I have expertise on.
Yeah.
I do, and the same is true for my patients. I don't see a ton of patients, but I do have patients who are on both sides of the spectrum. And I know there are some that I'm going to see this week who are going to be upset or scared or angry about Trump winning, and I know there are going to be others that are going to be happy.
Mhm.
And when I'm working with them, I try to just focus on what are their goals, what do they need, what's my role. Um, I like that they don't know my views. I think most patients think I agree with them,
Mhm.
because I try to get them, and but yeah, I don't. It hasn't been an issue of conflict, but it is kind of like there's a question too among therapists about like how genuine you are, and like you don't want to be too much of a closed book or disingenuous or misrepresent who
Mhm.
you are.
Mhm.
I think that can actually pose problems for the treatment too. But luckily, there aren't a lot of times that I'm really pointedly asked, what do you believe about position X or Y?
Mhm.
And if
Mhm.
you disagree, the therapy's gonna end.
Mhm.
That hasn't happened too many times for me.
Well, I think that neutrality is really admirable. And it was something that I was really surprised when I started seeing schools start to make political endorsements or put political pressure on students, because I feel like that is it's it sort of gets in the way of the individual's freedom to express themselves and to go through their own intellectual process when making these kinds of decisions that we all acknowledge are really important decisions that matter a lot to individuals. And so, as someone who's speaking for or heading up an institution, maintaining that neutrality is I think it's really important actually. And I wish more people would take that stance. And I don't head an institution and I don't speak for an institution. And I've been really open about a lot of my thoughts on this in other conversations that I've had. I have said who I voted for. I voted for Trump this time. I'm not a Trump fanatic and I'm not a super anti Democrat, but I have not been happy with Democrat policies over the last several years, and I wanted to see something that changed some of that. So I've talked about that, but I don't like some of the polarization that I see happening. For me, it was sort of a careful and nuanced decision, and
Yeah.
I don't think that it's what in these kind of casual conversations we hear people really demonizing the people on who chose the other direction politically, and I think
Yes.
that's really dangerous because it's half the country we're talking about, generally speaking, and
Yeah.
to just sort of throw away the opinions or the people because of the opinions on that kind of scale, I think is fundamentally dehumanizing. And people make their decisions based on their own value sets as well as the information that they're interacting with. There should be a respect for that and an ability, especially in the position of therapy or kind of professional representation, to be able to still recognize the humanity and the dignity of people who would make a choice that's different than a choice that you would make.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One thing that we were talking about too about this issue was that like both sides have these fears
Mm-hmm.
of looming authoritarianism coming from the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And there does seem to be actually a point of consensus that both sides really don't want that.
Mm-hmm.
Presum- I was really surprised to hear, I think maybe it was Harrison Ford endorsed Kamala Harris because he thought that she would protect free speech more or
Mm.
something like that. And
Interesting.
that's totally shocking to me because I haven't heard pro censorship arguments on the right, and I have heard a lot of pro censorship arguments on the left. Like I
Mhm.
think I think Tim Walz said that he thought misinformation should be censored. You see, a
Mhm.
lot of people on the left believe that hate speech should be censored. Obviously, my concern is that those are poorly defined terms and they won't be applied fairly, and
Mhm.
they'll be applied to political effect and things like that. But um, it is interesting to me that somebody would vote for Kamala Harris because they want free speech,
Hmm.
and somebody would vote for Trump for the same reason.
Hmm.
And it's almost like there is one thing that's positive about that, which is that the values are not really that different.
Hmm.
Neither one wants authoritarianism. They maybe have a different sense of what that is.
Hmm.
Um, you know, the big concern on the left was one big concern is Trump's going to use the legal system to go after his opponents, and they don't want that. But a lot of people voted for Trump because they feel like the legal system was used to go after him and that was unfair.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there is this at least congruence in values
Hmm.
of like the legal system shouldn't be politicized to go after people, even if people disagree about what's actually happening on each side with those
Hmm.
issues.
Hmm.
Um, and there were lots of issues like that. Who's better for the working class? Who's better for American manufacturing? Who's tougher on the border? Who's like it was kind of crazy almost that the values that were addressed on both sides actually seemed both sides say they're against racism, both sides condemn sexism. They have a different sense of what that means. And so, but there is this kind of interesting values alignment. I, I wrote an article. I don't know if you've read this, but I wrote this article about the overactive superego in American politics a few years ago for the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, yes, I think I did read that.
But that was kind of like a similar thing where there was I kind of argued more or less that at least the social justice side of the left was very related to this overactive superego and lots of like moralization, moral ideals, and judgment, and those types of things were very active on that side, and that on the populist right more it tended to be more uninhibited, like id oriented stuff. So there was
Hmm.
kind of like the divide was almost like super ego versus id in
Hmm.
American politics. And but it's interesting because I think that people on both sides of the spectrum liked that art. Not everybody, but some people on both sides liked it because they saw that they thought, yeah, morality is good. We're the moral party or something. That's right. And like, or they thought like, yeah, the it is good. Like we're the uninhibited, fun, kind of rude party. And
Hmm.
there was almost like it's an interesting point where you could actually like both sides could almost kind of agree on this, but their
Hmm.
value, their sense of what it meant, it was different. So it's interesting to me the weird ways, and it's not quite systematic, but there are weird ways where there are these kinds of points of consensus,
Hmm.
oddly, even
Hmm.
though then they both think the other side is going to become a dictator or something. They both think whatever it is, they both think the other side is racist. They both think the other side is discriminating and
Hmm.
and bigoted. They both think the other side supports violence.
Hmm.
There are these like weird there are weird ways that they mirror each other.
Yeah, I think your point about the fear of authoritarianism is a really good point. And that conversation about left versus right wing authoritarianism and what the characteristics of those two phenomena are. And and it is interesting. I think this is one of the problems with the polarization itself is that people are catastrophizing on both sides and seeing this is such an existential crisis. Whoever, if my candidate doesn't get into office, then there's this sort of this magnification of the sense of threat that can happen. And and I think another thing that I found really interesting and kind of sobering, I can remember and I'm just being really um transparent about my own sort of political thoughts. I can remember in uh voting for Obama. I phone banked for Obama. And then my family, we were so excited when he got into office that we flew to DC to be there on the
Oh,
mall to watch him inaugurated. And I had this real excitement at the time for this is going to be fresh, this is going to be changed, there's going to be this great energy that moves things in a positive direction.
yeah.
And this time around, I didn't feel that at all. This election cycle, I just felt this real sadness for this heavy and ugly manipulation that felt like it was going on both sides, and this
Mm.
fever pitch that things felt like they were reaching. And it's almost like right now I acknowledge and I'm aware there are probably people who turned this off as soon as I said that I voted for Trump, you know? And then there's other people who are so excited that there was a Trump win and are like on Twitter right now, there's all these threads asking for people to post the worst lib meltdowns. They want to
Uh,
gloat, they want to watch people be really upset and sad. And um, I think that that energy is so upsetting to see. I'd really love to see people find that common ground that you're talking about and come
yeah.
together for something positive.
Well, I think this is a great example. Like you're talking about the why would people be attracted to those memes?
Mhm.
That's a clinical question. I really want to formulate what this is. This is an example of where we can put on our hats as clinicians to provide an explanation. My theory about this, and I obviously don't have data, but my theory is that these are people who feel voiceless and demonized.
Mhm.
And they feel like there are intentional aspects to make them feel powerless and to isolate them and to demonize them and to shame them. And that turns into aggression. You
Mhm.
know, a lot of aggression is you want to make somebody else feel something that you couldn't bear to feel yourself.
Mhm.
So it's like there's different types of aggression in the sense of like I could commit aggression to make somebody feel humiliated, to make them feel anxious, to make them feel sad. Like what am I trying, what's the negative emotion I'm trying to make them feel or that I'm taking pleasure in making them feel? And it's probably the thing that I felt made to feel but couldn't bear feeling. So I want them to feel a sense of, and think about it, because it's like they feel voiceless.
Mhm.
They feel like they're losing their country. They feel, it's like the thing that their gratification is they're having to feel the thing that I've been made to feel and didn't want to feel.
Mhm.
And so uh, there's a learning opportunity here to get it to the point of like not this sadistic,
Mhm.
ritual, but to actually get it to a point of like uh, there needs to be more of a dialogue. And I think they feel like um you know I think they feel really, really attacked themselves and really condescended to and really shamed, and they want them to feel like losers.
Mhm.
It's like I think that's like a big part. So I think there's a learning opportunity, but the part of what's driving it, in my view, is the total lack of dialogue,
Mhm.
like the total lack of understanding other views. And I think to me, the big failure is with civil society institutions, because I do think that they've been almost across the board captured by a particular social justice ideology that's on the left. And it means that uh, I think that most of the people that I know who are on the right have an awareness of what social justice ideology is and what animates them.
Mhm.
Most of the people that I know who are on the left or believe in social justice ideology do not know what the critiques are. They think you're just a racist and they don't think about it. And I think like if there were a dialogue about these issues nationally, there would be a lot more understanding. And I think it would lead to less of these like really toxically negative feelings that fuel the aggression that can kind of spiral. And it's not just the aggression, but fuel the paranoid fantasies. They fuel all of this stuff is fueled, I think, ultimately by the inability to have a robust dialogue at institutions. And it's education, especially higher ed, but K through 12 too. It's in like academic research, and that's similar, but the news media, the entertainment industry, the tech companies, corporate HR, a lot of government agencies, we talk about mental health all the time as a place that has similar biases. The inability to talk about these issues by having a dialogue fuels these more primitive behaviors that have the capacity to really spiral out of control. So I really think the core of it is a failure of dialogue. And I put the blame primarily on the civil society institutions. That it's like it's not the same to say, well, look at these truckers who voted for Trump are really sadistic, and so's the New York Times and Harvard and Google. That's not symmetrical.
Mm.
Like the truckers don't have the same responsibility to foster national discourse that other civil society institutes do. So when those civil society institutions are failing, it to foster dialogue, it really, I think, contributes to these cycles of misunderstanding and
Mm.
conflict.
And with dialogue being so important, how do people facilitate that dialogue when we've grown so entrenched in our bubbles? I mean, I know that I was in a bubble. I know that I've been in a bit of a bubble.
Yeah.
And yet I'm actively trying not to be, but I still know that I kind of end up there when I'm on social media
Yeah.
or, spending so much of my time in conversation with people who have been similarly concerned about social justice, DEI,
Right.
COVID mandates, these kinds of things. You know that you're talking with people who are oriented in a particular way with a particular worldview. And then you look at sort of the main, I don't know if you want to call it mainstream media, but the big news sources, and you see the all out press that they did to basically terrify people that their rights were going to be taken away if they didn't vote blue on this one. There's there's a complete failure of people to see and recognize humanity across the political spectrum right now on in so many cases. And how do we break through that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to do it as an individual citizen with your neighbors. And I mean, I think that's a valuable thing to do. And I do have some suggestions which we can talk about, which I think can help a little bit in relationships. But it's really so much driven by the institutions. If the whole education system is totally dominated by people on one side,
Mhm.
the other side doesn't have like any hearing or space. And like not even that, but like at a lot of places, like disagreeing with social justice is basically considered hate speech and
Mhm.
subject to not just social ostracization and indirect consequences, gossip, harassment, that sort of thing, or professional consequences, but actually like uh, institutional action and
Right.
discipline. And so in that context, it's like it's really hard to see how things get fixed. Like if corporate cultures are all in on one side of this discourse and they don't make any room for the other side, it's really, I think it's really, really hard for individuals to repair it. That's why we have to have like a change in these civil society institutions. And they really went they took a stance. I think this goes back to 2016, really. I think they were all in on social justice before then, but
Mhm.
they just basically said we're not doing the both sides thing. The other side's disagreeing with social justice is too despicable of a view to even engage it in conversation. And once they did that, I think that's when things started to get chaotic. I do think it was before Trump announced. And you can look, Musa Al-Gharbi is a great researcher at Heterodox Academy, and he has lots of data that show that the increase in politicized language about racism and sexism and stuff really started in 2013,
Oh,
2014,
okay.
and has started well before Trump. And
Mm,
that's what I noticed in universities and in New York and places here, that so it really, I think there's a reason to think it started before that. But definitely in 2016 they kind of said we're not doing both sides, and then the conversation was lost, and I think it's kind of inevitable. I don't know if this is a Freud quote, but it's kind of like you enact what you can't say or something like that. It's like
mm,
I can't remember exactly how it is, but it's like it's a classic psychotherapy sentiment that if you can't talk about it, you're going to enact it destructively. So by ending dialogue, I really hold our civil society institutions very responsible for failing to allow dialogue on the issues that are dividing the country right now. And I think that fuels everything from like the paranoia to the anger to sadism, mistrust, and we've all kind of become more borderline, basically.
mm.
And I think it's because we can't talk. And it's really hard to do it as like a lone citizen when all of these institutions have taken one side in this way.
Will you say a little bit more about that becoming more borderline? I think that it's really striking how much the socio-political divide resembles splitting, for instance. But
Yeah.
I mean, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's kind of, well, I guess I probably mean it like in psychoanalysis,
Hmm.
one of the ways that you categorize functioning is on a continuum from like mature, neurotic, borderline, and psychotic.
Okay.
That's the continuum. So like mature is like well functioning, neurotic is actually like fine. That's like people with like simple depression or maybe even things that don't quite classify as disorders. Borderline is kind of this level of functioning that's in between like somebody with a simple depression diagnosis and somebody with a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia.
Hmm.
And so it's a level of functioning in between. So your emotion regulation becomes really unstable. Your sense of identity becomes unstable. Your sense of reality becomes unstable. And it's not necessarily like you're hallucinating or you have delusions, but your functioning is really impaired by a lack of coherent self and other, you know, a representation of yourself and others and your ability to regulate your emotions, formulate your thoughts.
Hmm.
So like it could be that borderline range of functioning could include a lot of things, like including like paranoia, where like you're at Dunkin' Donuts and you order your coffee, and when it's ready, they call out your name wrong, and you know that they did it on purpose because they don't like you for some reason. It's kind of like, yeah, it's not necessarily like a paranoid delusion and schizophrenia, but like your sense of what's real and what's not is getting pretty off
Skewed.
kilter. The political analogy there was like, I think I told you that in 2016, I knew people who were thinking, what do we do when Trump puts everybody on trains and ships them off to the gas chambers?
Hmm.
And they really thought that was a viable thing that was likely to happen, and they were scared and didn't know how to avoid that from happening. But that's divorced enough from reality that if it wasn't happening at such a mass level in society, you'd actually say, I think you need to see a psychiatrist.
Hmm.
But it was a common enough belief that it wasn't really diagnostic of anything because it's just like almost normal for, millions of people.
Hmm.
Um, But other things are just like emotion dysregulation, the inability to tolerate people with different views. You would see sometimes, again, this was a lot more in 2016, 2017, but you would see people who couldn't sit still at a conversation, hearing somebody with a different view speak. They would start shaking, or they'd become violent, or they'd just lose touch with reality, like really flooded and totally unable to tolerate hearing a different opinion, in a way that, again, if that happened in another context where you can't talk to your friend about why they were late to lunch or something
Hmm.
or whatever. If it's like, or maybe it's more serious than that, but where you really acted that way, I think
Hmm.
people would say, this is a serious, serious issue. So, like the level of functioning related to politics seems to have like dropped a level from like neurotic to borderline.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for that explanation. I think that's a really good summary. And it seems like the media is very responsible for so much of this influence, not just the media, but also, as you say, the civil institutions are they've
Yeah,
drummed this up.
and I know people now who think, uh, Trump is going to become Hitler,
Hmm.
he's ready to kill people and execute, and he'll never leave. He's going to stay in power forever. And I mean, I don't think it's as common, as widespread as it was in 2017,
Hmm.
but I think there are lots of people who think that's going to happen. Um, and and it's so hard for people to talk about it.
Hmm.
That's I think that it's kind of gotten, this divide has been cultivated where
Hmm.
people can't talk. I blame the education system more than the media. I think the
Hmm.
education system, especially higher ed, is a much bigger, because they're never exposed to alternate views. And they get this false sense that there's this obvious right answer to all these very complicated questions. They lose their ability to think in nuance about these issues. And it makes people really fragile and fanatical and unhinged.
Hmm.
And the media builds off of that. But I think the education system is much more probably to blame than the media.
That does make a lot of sense. And I know I've probably mentioned this to you in conversation before, but when I was in graduate school, one of the really big, I suppose, red flags or really concerning things that happened to me was my academic advisor said, we know we're not training therapists who are going to be able to work with the Trump supporter.
Right,
And so
right,
there
right.
was this recognition that this is a whole class of American that our counselors are not able to help. This entire swath of the US, we can't help them. And it's not because we pathologize them, because if we could give them a diagnosis, we could help them. It's because they're just untouchable to us. And that is the education system. That's higher
Well,
education.
there's I think there's a kind of almost sadism in that, honestly, because it's saying like these people can go to hell and I don't care how much they suffer. There's real aggression. We have a responsibility to treat everyone, and I think the idea of precluding someone from treatment because of their political views is obviously profoundly unethical
Mhm.
by any medical standard, and um, and just really hateful and destructive. And I think it's people who, you're like, think about the people who want to see them crying about losing the election. It's
Mhm.
like they've had their experiences of aggression too.
Mhm.
But we're kind of like we are communicating to each other, but it's in this really primitive way. It's
Mhm.
I'm going to hurt you so you know what I felt, and then they're going to hurt back so you know what they felt. And it's like this is like it's just going to spiral. Like it's not, uh we can't do this.
That's the very thing that really concerns me. At some point, in order to make peace, you have to choose to be to have a peaceful perspective. You have to choose to put aside your own desire for vengeance or revenge and make a choice to be gracious and accept a compromise, accept that things are not the way that you necessarily wish that they were.
Yes. Well, and the best tool for communicating around these is to try to think dialectically, and that means acknowledging pros and cons on both sides. Everybody needs the capacity to do this in a real sincere way. I for one, like, I don't feel obligated to defend negative things that are done by any politician.
Mhm.
That's just not something I'm going to waste energy on. Like, if they do something that I think is unethical or say something that I don't think they should have said, I don't need to defend that. They're not perfect. I don't need to think that they're perfect. I can acknowledge that about anybody.
Mhm.
And then I can say what I think the strengths are of the side. But that's a totally different conversation from somebody who feels like they need to defend absolutely everything on one side and insult absolutely everything on the other, which I think is kind of immature.
Mhm.
Ultimately, it's at least psychologically immature, this inability to tolerate, like, yeah, like, people say fucked up things on both sides. I had a really good conversation with a friend about the election recently, and and it was kind of one of the issues was about the nature of racial aggression on both sides. And it was I think it was actually a good conversation. I felt like it got me thinking about these issues more. There are definitely people on both sides who have racial aggression towards different groups.
Mhm.
Like, it's just like, that's just real. Like, it's like, you don't need to pretend that that's not there. Like, it's just true. And there's people of every racial group that have racial aggression towards every other racial group. It's just like, it's just true.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think that they manifest differently. And I do think that the racial aggression on the right tends to be more like demeaning and insulting comments on social media or on Twitter, or it's like memes and stuff like that. And I think on the right, it's more, it's I think there's some of that. I think there's a fair amount of that, but I think at the level of the party, it's much more polished, but it's more at the level of policy that they think, that they really will want policies that reflect this is the privileged group and this is the oppressed group,
Mhm.
or this is it has a different flavor to it. I don't think it's less aggressive, but it has much um, more polish to it.
Mhm.
And so I think, but it was just interesting talking to my friend about how do you weigh the two sides? Somebody makes this comment, which I don't want to have to defend anybody's comment that I didn't make, I don't, but then I compare that with comments on the other side. And um, it was another one of these moments where I was kind of like, I think our values are actually the same. Even if
Mhm.
we have a different formulation, like, we both kind of think that the racial hatred goes in all directions and it's all wrong when it happens, but we might have a different formulation of how we think it's manifesting on each side. Um, so, it's like when you can get that dialogue, it's a really positive thing.
I think that's you're coming back to that point of shared value and how much more we have in common universally.
Yes.
And I think to me, it's important to remember that these political parties are institutions, and every institution has two missions. It has its mission, and then it has its need to maintain itself and to grow itself. So it's self-interested plus interested in whatever it's purporting to do. And sometimes that self-interest can overtake the need to maintain and grow itself can be bigger than the need to perpetuate whatever it's doing. And if both parties are geared towards, catering to the American citizen and promoting whatever American values are there, a lot of those are going to have universals and overlap.
Yes.
And then the institutions themselves do a lot of work to convince you and market to you that they're the one that can do that for you. And so much of that ends up being sort of a smokescreen that gets in the way. And if we remember that, I think that we can detach a little bit from the political fervor.
I I think so too. I think there's something else that like I guess this is a message. I have a criticism of how the right communicates. I know that we need to wrap up. We don't want to go into another thing. Do you need to go soon?
Yeah, I do. But if you want to just maybe give a summary, maybe we can get into it on a future conversation if
Let's
it's
get into it.
relevant.
Let's get into it on a future conversation, but I'll say because I know that we talked about discussing this, but
Mhm.
like I think that the right communicates about the things they're concerned about indirectly often.
Mhm.
And I think it really hurts them.
Mhm.
And one example of this is anti-white racial aggression.
Mhm.
I think that there are a lot of people on the right that are really upset about it. They perceive it in the culture, they perceive it in institutions. They find it very hurtful and demeaning and insulting, and they're angry about it. They care deeply about it, but they can't say it.
Mhm.
They talk about it indirectly, and they end up in talking about patriotism or the founding fathers or free speech, which might all be great things, but they're not the issue.
Mhm.
And I think that there's something, it really hurts them that they can't just say hatred towards all groups is wrong, but I'm
Mhm.
feeling like there's more that's happening towards anti-white hate. Let me give you some examples and actually talk about it assertively and directly. If they make their arguments indirectly, then they're not going to be heard and they're going to have a harder time making progress. I think they often underestimate how much liberals also think anti-white racial aggression is wrong, but they're not hearing the argument of this is where I see it happening and why I think it's a problem. And I
Mhm.
think that they're probably underestimating how successful a non-hateful but candid and direct discussion of that issue could make significant progress for them on the things they care about. So
Mhm.
it's like that's another thing of like indirect communication that I think can really make things spiral as opposed to
Mhm.
helping because it's people aren't saying what they actually care about directly.
Mhm. Oh, that's really interesting. I'd love to get into a bigger conversation with you about that cultural inability to address anti-white racism and why that is and how people can go about developing that conversation so that it can be had on a mature level.
Yes, and they need to have a message of love and positivity and inclusion when they
Mhm.
talk about this. But they need to say, but this matters.
Mhm.
And I think I would just not underestimate how powerful it could be to have like a diverse group of like positive, non-hateful people saying this is a growing issue in society and we need to address it. And if they can't do it, they're never going to address it. It will never get addressed if you can't say it.
Mhm.
But people are terrified to say it. And I don't think they should be because it's true. All forms of racial aggression are wrong. This is the one that we seem to have a hard time with right now.
Mhm.
Um, and so we can just talk about it. But
Absolutely. I agree.
okay. All right. Good
Well,
talking with you.
thank you so much for a really good conversation. I hope it's helpful to some people. And, if you're watching this and you want to weigh in, please comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. All right. Take care, Andrew. Thanks.